knew something was off the very instant the pilot scanned my ID. His expression froze, rigid, like a man who had just glimpsed a ghost from another world. Then the cockpit screen behind him flared violently red, almost as if the machine itself had been shocked by my presence. An alarm shrieked, harsh and insistent, and 4 words materialized on the display in stark military font. Alert Admiral Ghost, maximum security. Before I could even exhale, the roar of engines filled the tarmac as 2 F-22 Raptors surged forward, engines screaming, forming a precise escort along either side of the jet. And behind me, standing like a man suddenly dethroned, was my fiancé's father, Richard Dawson, the man who had spent that entire morning making it abundantly clear I was nothing more than an unwelcome outsider, now gawked with his jaw slack, utterly unprepared for what he was witnessing. "Ma'am," the pilot stammered, voice tight with tension, "your protection detail is ready." At that moment, the man who had assumed he was untouchable, who believed he could command everyone and everything around him, had no idea who he was truly looking at. And just like that, everything changed. If someone had told me a year ago that I would find myself on a sun-baked Florida runway, standing beside a billionaire-level private jet, while 2 F-22 Raptors throttled their engines as my personal escort, I would have laughed outright. Life's defining moments, I'd always believed, were quieter than that. They were unseen, subtle, moments that carved themselves into your soul without anyone else noticing. And yet, life had an ironic way of pulling what you'd kept tucked away into the harsh glare of the spotlight. The morning had begun like any other humid Saturday, the warm Florida air slipping lazily between the palms. Daniel, my fiancé, had just finished a grueling 24-hour shift at the rescue station. At 6 a.m., his text appeared. "Dad wants to talk wedding venues today. Can you go with him for me?" I hesitated, naturally. His father had made his disdain clear from the first moment we met. Perhaps it was the money, old, new Florida yachts, sprawling properties, gated country clubs. Or perhaps it was that he couldn't reconcile someone with a military background being part of his son's life. Regardless, I had been raised to respect even those who disrespected me, and Daniel had shared that philosophy, so I said yes. Richard arrived in a spotless black SUV at exactly 8 a.m., not a second early, not a second late. He didn't greet me, didn't even glance up from his phone as I slid into the passenger seat. "You're late," he barked, glancing at the clock. It was 7:59. I quietly fastened my seatbelt. His energy was sharp, abrupt, a walking announcement of his own importance. Halfway to the airport, he finally looked at me appraisingly and said, "At least you're dressed decently today. My son deserves a woman with a little class." I simply folded my hands in my lap and watched the palm trees blur past. My years in the Navy had taught me patience, calm, endurance. Words were just that, words. At the private aviation terminal, his assistants sprang forward to take the luggage as Richard strode ahead, expecting silence in my wake. The jet on the tarmac gleamed like polished pearl, the kind of aircraft that only CEOs, diplomats, or government officials could afford. Inside, he continued his pattern of dominance, a hard look, snapping orders to the flight crew, speaking loudly on the phone about closing deals, while I remained invisible. When the pilot approached, clipboard in hand, to check my ID, Richard waved him off. "She's nobody, just do your job." I handed over my card, worn from years of travel, its edges soft, the printing slightly faded but legible. The pilot took 2 steps before freezing. His posture stiffened, his breath hitched. He moved toward the cockpit with a weighty reverence in his hands, the ID suddenly seeming like something sacred. The door didn't shut fully, and I caught the sharp electronic beep, the alarm, the red screen flaring. Richard's eyes shot to me. "What is that?" The pilot returned, pale as paper. "Ma'am, I need you to step forward." Richard's scoff barely concealed his confusion. "You mean me?" "No, sir. Her." The words hit like a blow. My ID returned, held reverently, and the pilot uttered the sentence that would rewrite the morning entirely. "Your protection detail is ready, Admiral Ghost." Richard's face twisted in disbelief. "Admiral what?" Outside, the F-22s throttled into position, engines growling like predators. Richard staggered, his voice lost somewhere between fear and awe. The pilot's trembling explanation spilled out. "Admiral Ghost is an extremely restricted naval intelligence marker." I didn't say a word, simply nodded for him to continue. Engines roared. The F-22s held formation like clockwork, shadows sliding across our fuselage. Richard's voice, usually so commanding, now cracked. What exactly are you?" I remained calm. "Just a clearance status," I said softly. "That's not an answer," he snapped. "It's the one you're going to get right now," I replied. As the jet surged forward, he hit his own seat back, unprepared for the sudden liftoff, his body finding no leverage in the luxurious interior. The conversation that followed was taut with tension. Richard demanded to understand, to grasp why the world had bent in this way for me, why fighter jets flanked a civilian flight simply because I existed. I explained, carefully, that normality was earned, that service required anonymity, and that my life had been built on quiet acts that no one would ever read about in the papers. I told him about liaison work, joint operations, intelligence coordination, and the invisible guidance I offered those who were too critical to risk. He asked if I was a bodyguard. I shook my head. "More like a shadow that ensures the bodyguard doesn't miss anything." Richard's prideful nature clashed with the reality he had stumbled into. He was used to control, to being the highest authority in any room, and now he was faced with someone whose power he couldn't challenge. Questions came. Why hadn't Daniel known? Why such secrecy? I explained only as much as protocol allowed, watching his reactions: confusion, awe, humility. His edge softened in small increments, fractured by the truth I presented. Identity isn't always about titles or wealth. Sometimes it's built in silent acts of service, in sacrifices invisible to the world. Turbulence rattled the cabin briefly, a small reminder of the larger world outside. Yet I remained steady, calm. Richard, for the first time in months, or perhaps years, was no longer entirely in control. His questions dwindled to murmurs. Why had I chosen this path? Did I regret it? I admitted only the regret of missed moments, never the service itself. Outside, the F-22s held steady, their metal skim glinting in the sun. He watched, witnessing power unlike anything his business empire had ever produced. By the time the jet leveled at cruising altitude, the tension had shifted imperceptibly. Richard's voice was quieter, reflective. My words had punctured his assumptions, and for a fleeting moment he saw me, not the fiancée he had underestimated, not the woman he had dismissed, but the person forged in sacrifice, strategy, and silent courage. The pilot stepped out again, reporting formal updates, while I remained the constant in the room, calm, composed, unshaken. Richard leaned back, arms folded, trying to reassert himself, only to realize that in this moment, in this airspace, the world had someone else holding the weight of command. Finally, he admitted aloud, almost in wonder, that he had met titans of business, politics, and real estate, yet this protocol, this precision, this unseen authority, was something entirely different. "It's not power," I said softly, watching the ocean stretch endlessly below us. "It's protocol." He rubbed his temples, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little, the first cracks forming in the armor of a man who had been used to commanding all he saw. And in that quiet, suspended above the Florida coast, amid the hum of jet engines and the precise positioning of F-22s, something subtle had shifted. He looked down at the water, then back at me, seeing, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to live a life of service beyond recognition. "I misjudged you." I didn't say anything. He tried again. "I misjudged you badly." Still, I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is more honest than words. He cleared his throat. "Daniel never told me anything about this." "He doesn't know the details," I said. "He knows who I am, but not what I did, not what I was part of." "How could he not?" Richard asked. "Because I love him," I said. and because my job was to carry weight so others didn't have to. He blinked. Something softened in his face, something human. "He's a good man," Richard said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "one of the best." "And you think you're protecting him by keeping this side of your life locked away?" I looked at him steady and calm. "I know I am." Richard leaned back, exhaling. I thought you were just some ordinary woman trying to marry into money." "And now?" I asked. He hesitated. "Now I don't know what to think." "That's a start," I said. The jet continued its glide through the sky. Another few minutes passed in quiet, peaceful air. Then Richard asked something I didn't expect. "Were you ever scared?" "Yes," I said, "many times." "Then why do it?" "Because someone had to." He swallowed hard. "And because," I added softly, "service means standing where others can't." He sat very still, absorbing that. The sunlight shifted again, warming the cabin, and for the first time since boarding the plane, Richard Dawson didn't look like a man in control of everything. He looked like a man beginning to understand something bigger than himself. For a while, the cabin stayed quiet, almost peaceful, if not for the fighter jets slicing through the sky just outside our windows. Richard seemed lost in his own thoughts, staring at the F-22 ahead of us like it contained the answers to everything he'd misunderstood about me. But peace never lasts long at 38,000 feet. The first sign came as a faint chime over the intercom, soft, almost polite. Then a second chime followed, sharper. The pilot's voice came over the speaker, taut and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, well, sir and ma'am, we've received a distress alert from a nearby civilian aircraft. They're experiencing an electrical malfunction." Richard sat up fast. "Electrical malfunction? What does that mean? Are they going to crash into us?" "No," I said calmly. "It means they need assistance. It's standard." "Standard?" he snapped. This isn't a commercial airline. We don't have..." Before he could spiral further, the intercom returned. "The aircraft is requesting guidance from any flight with advanced communication capability. Since we have military escort, NORAD is asking if we can assist before they dispatch additional support." I unbuckled my belt. The moment I stood up, Richard panicked. "Where are you going? Sit down. Don't leave me here alone." "I'm going to the cockpit," I said. "Why? What are you going to do?" I met his eyes. Something useful. He blinked, stunned as I walked past him. Inside the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot were hunched over their instruments, voices tight as they spoke to ATC and the distressed aircraft. Lines of static crackled through the speakers. The air felt different, not chaotic, but concentrated. "Ma'am," the pilot said when he saw me, "they're losing navigation. Their autopilot just dropped offline. They're having trouble stabilizing their altitude." "Patch me through," I said. The pilot tapped a switch immediately. The headset was in my hands before I even asked. "This is Civilian Charter 79er Delta." A trembling voice crackled through. We're losing readings. Instruments aren't matching." The co-pilot whispered. "They're panicking." I clicked the transmitter. "This is Admiral Ghost," I said steadily. "Identify your remaining functionals." "Who, Admiral?" "Ma'am, our panel's dead. Most of it. We're in the blind up here." "Your horizon indicator," I asked. "Unreliable. Airspeed? Flickering. Engine temp? Holding." "Good," I said softly. "Then breathe. You're not falling. You're flying blind, but you're flying." The pilot glanced at me with something between respect and relief. "What's your pitch feel like?" I asked. "Slight downward drift. Pull to neutral, nothing more. Don't fight the aircraft. You'll overcorrect." I don't know if I can," I said, voice steady as bedrock. "You'll listen to my voice until your panels come back online. You understand?" A shaky breath, then, "Yes, ma'am." Richard stood in the cockpit doorway, pale and sweating. They can hear you?" "Yes," I said. "And you're helping them fly?" "I'm helping them not fall." The pilot exchanged a quick look with his co-pilot, one that told me he trusted me more than the instruments. "Civilian 79 Delta," I said. "I want you to follow our escort's shadow. They're breaking formation to guide you. Do not break visual contact. Outside, one of the F-22s peeled away from our wing and slid like a phantom into position above the distressed aircraft somewhere behind us. Richard whispered, They're obeying you." "Protocol," I said. But there was more to it than protocol. When lives were at risk, hierarchy wasn't about rank, it was about steadiness, calm, the ability to speak when others froze. "Turn 3 degrees left," I instructed. "Good. Hold. Level that descent. Slow. Slow. Perfect." Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 15. Time blurs when you're hanging in mid-air between hope and disaster. Then, through the static, the pilot of 79 Delta said, I think it's stabilizing. Ma'am? I think we've got control again." The cockpit around me exhaled. "Good," I said softly. "You're going to be okay. Keep visual contact with the escort until you're cleared for independent navigation." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. God bless you." I set the headset down gently. The pilot looked at me with something like reverence. "Ma'am, if you ever want a civilian flying job." I smiled. "I'm better in the shadows." When I stepped back into the cabin, Richard was standing there stiffly gripping the seat back in front of him. His face was drained, his hair slightly disheveled, and for once he wasn't trying to hide his shock. "You," he whispered, "you just kept a plane from falling out of the sky." "I guided them," I corrected softly. "They did the flying." "You," he stammered, "you sounded like a commander." I sat back down in my seat. When people are afraid, they need a steady voice, that's all. He swallowed, then swallowed again. "Daniel never told me you were like this." "I didn't tell him," I said. "He doesn't need to carry the weight of things I've done." His eyes dropped to the floor. "I treated you like you were beneath this family." I didn't respond. Richard rubbed his face with both hands. "My God, I didn't know." No anger, no arrogance, just a raw human voice. "You weren't meant to," I said gently. "Not everything in my life was meant to be known." He nodded slowly, small but meaningful. "Thank you," he whispered, "for helping those people. That's what service is, helping even when no one sees." Outside, the F-22 returned to its escort position behind us, sliding into formation like a guardian angel returning home. And somewhere deep inside Richard Dawson, something fundamental shifted, quietly but permanently. The jet cabin felt strangely quieter after the emergency had passed, like the air itself understood something profound had shifted. Even the hum of the engines seemed softer, less intrusive, almost respectful. Richard remained standing for a moment, staring at the F-22 gliding back into formation behind us. His shoulders rose and fell with a long, uneven breath, as if he were trying to reconcile the world he believed in with the one he had just witnessed. He finally sank into the leather seat across from me, not in his usual stiff-backed, commanding posture, but heavily, like a man who'd been carrying a burden he didn't realize was heavy until someone took it off him. For several long seconds he didn't speak, and I didn't push him. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I'd never seen in them before: humility. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. His voice trembled around the edges. "Have you ever lost someone because of what you did in the Navy?" I felt the question before I heard it, the kind that didn't just land in your ears, it landed in your bones. "Yes," I said quietly. He exhaled, slow, heavy, respectful. I figured. The sunlight drifting in from the window carved soft lines across his face. Age lines, worry lines, the traces of a man who'd fought his own battles, the kind fought in boardrooms and budgets, not war zones. For the first time, he looked less like a millionaire businessman and more like a father, a human being. "I always thought people in the military were just employees of the government," he admitted. "Never understood what you all actually carried." "Most people don't," I said, "and we don't expect them to." He nodded slowly, eyes on his hands. "My father served Korea. He never talked about it. I always assumed that meant it wasn't a big deal. Silence almost always means it was a big deal, I replied gently. He swallowed. I see that now. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt fragile and sincere. Then, almost reluctantly, Richard said, "You know, when Daniel first told me he was serious about you, I worried he was making a mistake." I raised an eyebrow. "Because I wasn't from a wealthy family?" "No," he said, "because you were quiet." That surprised me. He continued, "I thought quiet meant weak, that you wouldn't be able to handle the world my son would inherit. Business responsibility, people trying to take advantage of him. I didn't think you had the spine." He winced. How wrong I was. I didn't respond. He wasn't finished. "I'm not proud of how I spoke to you this morning," he said, "or the assumptions I made." His voice cracked slightly. "You've been carrying things I can't even imagine." I rested my hands loosely in my lap. "Richard, it isn't about comparing burdens. We just live different lives." "That's exactly it," he said. "I lived mine loudly, you lived yours quietly, and yet you have more strength than most of the men I've ever known." I offered a small, tired smile. "Strength comes in different forms, that's what I'm learning." He leaned back, rubbing the side of his jaw. "I've always been protective of Daniel, maybe too much. He's the best thing I ever did in my life. I didn't want him marrying someone who couldn't stand beside him." "And now?" I asked gently. "And now," he said, looking directly at me, "I realized he found someone who can stand in front of him if needed." That struck deeper than he knew. He hesitated, then said something I never expected to hear from him, something he might never have said if he hadn't watched me steady a failing aircraft in midair. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the cabin like a fragile offering. "For every dismissive word I said, for every assumption, for treating you like you were beneath us." He shook his head. "You're the kind of woman any father should be grateful to see walk into his son's life." I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to allow the moment to settle. "Thank you," I said softly. He blinked a little, surprised by the simplicity of my response. "Really? That's it? You apologized and you meant it?" "Yes." I got yes. "Then that's enough," I said. Richard leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Can I ask one more thing? Just one." "Go ahead." "Will you tell Daniel about any of this?" I shook my head gently. "Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not ever in detail." "But why?" he pressed, voice soft, not demanding. "Because I want our marriage to be built on the life we build together," I said, "not the life I lived before I met him. And because some parts of me belong to the people I served with and the people we lost." Richard's eyes softened. "I understand." "And because," I added, "if Daniel ever knew everything, he'd worry, and worry chips away at a person." Richard let out a breath he'd been holding. "You're protecting him." "Yes," I said, "in the only way I know how." The jet hummed on. The escort jets remained steadfast. But something else occurred in that moment, something invisible, something quiet, something far more important than military protocol. Respect. It had finally settled between us. Richard cleared his throat. "I'd like to start over with you, if that's something you'd accept." I looked at him, really looked at him, the proud man, the flawed man, the father trying in his own way to do better. "I'd like that," I said. His shoulders eased. "Thank you." Just then, the pilot's voice returned over the intercom. "We're approaching our destination. Escort will disengage after descent." Richard looked out the window again, at the raptors, at the sky, at the truth he could no longer unsee. "You know," he murmured, "I thought I understood what mattered in life." A pause. "But I think you just taught me otherwise." I didn't answer. Some things don't need words. The day of our wedding dawned with the kind of quiet golden light that makes ordinary mornings feel sacred. Daniel and I had chosen a small chapel overlooking the water, a place where the waves rolled close enough to hear, but gentle enough to soothe even the heaviest heart. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just honest, simple beauty, the kind of beauty I'd missed during the years when my life was measured in missions, not moments. I arrived early, standing just outside the chapel doors as the musicians warmed up inside. My dress wasn't a traditional one. I had chosen something elegant but simple,
a reflection of the life I wanted to build with Daniel, one grounded in truth, not titles. The breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming magnolia. For the first time in a long while, I felt whole.
Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, Richard, not in his usual stern business attire, not radiating the imposing confidence he carried like a shield. Today he looked softer, lighter. He wore a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly, but it was his expression that stood out: humility, hope, and something that looked an awful lot like gratitude. "May I?" he asked, gestured toward my bouquet. I nodded, handing it to him. He adjusted one of the ribbons gently, then offered the flowers back. "You look beautiful," he said, voice surprisingly steady. "Thank you," I replied. There was a pause, a real pause, not the awkward kind, the kind where two people finally stand on level ground. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about that day on the jet, and what I saw, and what you carried." He took a breath. "I said some ugly things to you before. Unfair things." "You apologized," I reminded him. "Yes," he said, "but I want you to know something." He straightened, meeting my eyes fully. "I'm proud, truly proud, that my son is marrying you, and I'm grateful for the life he's going to have because of who you are. Not Admiral Ghost. You." For a moment, my throat tightened. Not because of the compliment, but because authenticity rarely sounded so clear. "Richard," I said softly, "thank you. That means more than you know." He nodded, swallowing a hint of emotion. "I'd like to walk you in, if you'll let me." I hesitated, not because I didn't want him to, but because I wanted the moment to matter, to feel earned. "It would be an honor," I said. And just like that, something redemptive settled between us. The chapel doors opened. The soft notes of the piano drifted out. Daniel stood at the end of the aisle, hands clasped, eyes already glistening. His smile widened as soon as he saw me. Richard offered his arm. I accepted. As we walked, the world seemed to fall quiet. Guests rose to their feet. I saw familiar faces. Friends, a few colleagues, even neighbors who'd watched Daniel grow up. And at the very front, the man I loved, the man who knew me, not by my history, not by my code name, but by my heart. We reached the altar. Richard placed my hand in Daniel's. "Take care of her," he whispered. Daniel smiled. "Always." The ceremony unfolded like a gentle tide, vows spoken with trembling conviction, rings exchanged with steady hands, promises layered one upon the next. We were pronounced husband and wife beneath a dome of warm light and teary eyes. But the moment I'll never forget happened during the reception. Richard stood and tapped his glass. I had expected a simple toast, maybe something polite and brief, but when he cleared his throat, the room immediately fell silent. "If you know me," he began, "you know I've spent most of my life believing success is measured in dollars, influence, status." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. "But a little while ago, I learned that I've been measuring the wrong thing." He turned, looking directly at me. "I didn't welcome this woman into our family with the respect she deserved. I judged her by what I could see, instead of what she had lived, and I couldn't have been more wrong." Daniel squeezed my hand. My heart tightened. Richard continued, "Strength isn't loud. It isn't flashy. Real strength," he gestured toward me, "real strength can walk into a room quietly and still change the air." The room remained perfectly still. "I want my son's new wife to know that I see her, and I'm grateful for everything she's done for this country, for our family, and for the man she loves." He raised his glass. "To the bravest woman I've ever met. Welcome to the family." The applause came soft at first, then warm, then full. A genuine celebration not of the past, but of the path forward. Later that evening, when the guests began to drift home and the soft lights glowed golden across the water, I stepped outside alone for a breath of cool air. The horizon was painted in lavender and orange, the end of a perfect day.
Footsteps approached behind me. Daniel slipped his arms around my waist. "You okay?" I nodded. "More than okay." He rested his chin on my shoulder. "I saw you and my dad talking earlier. Everything all right?" I smiled softly. "Better than all right." He kissed my cheek. "You know, you don't have to tell me everything about your past. I love you for who you are right now." That, more than anything, meant everything. I turned, took his hands, and said, "We all have chapters that made us who we are. Some stay closed for a reason." "And I'm okay with that," he said. We watched the sunset together, wrapped in a peace I hadn't felt in years. The kind that comes when truth and forgiveness finally meet in the same room. As the last bit of sun dipped below the water, I whispered something not to Daniel, not to Richard, but to myself. Service is sacrifice. Love is healing. And forgiveness. Forgiveness is what lets us move forward. And that's what I want anyone listening to remember. Never judge a person by the part of their story you can see. Everyone carries chapters you know nothing about, and some heroes walk among us quietly without applause. If this story touched you, share it with someone who could use its reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay with us. Your presence matters.